Welcome to episode 14 of It's All in Your Head podcast. And today we're going to talk about how to be more functional and safe in your emotional relationships. Tara, how are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. Hey, I love this topic today. What do you think about it?
I think we're going to get into some things in this topic. I'm excited about it too.
Yeah, me too. Because one of the things I really love about you, Tara, is that you and I are emotionally safe for each other.
Absolutely.
We know how to do that. And we know how to do that because we treat each other with respect. And there isn't anything that I tell you that I feel judged by you about. And that's the nature of what emotional intimacy is. And I can tell you things about my past, and you don't bring it up in a conversation, even when we're having a hard conversation. And that's the nature of being emotionally intimate with somebody, is that we're safe and we know the rules. And those rules mean that we don't bring up the past into a conversation, no matter what the conversation is. And some of the hardest things we do is try to teach these things to our clients. Like we've talked about some of the couples that we've worked with. You were telling me a story a little while ago. Tell me that story again about some of the things you're having to deal with.
To not be very specific, but I'll say what I notice is that there's a lot of, for lack of a better word, disrespect when it comes to the most important relationships that we have. So our love relationships or romantic relationships, we will say things to our romantic partner that we would never say to a friend, ever. And we expect them just to accept those words or that treatment, and then continue in the relationship like it's not been said before, not understanding that all of those words kind of erode at the foundation of the love that the relationship was built on in the first place.
Yeah, emotional intimacy is far more fragile than we think it is. I like to compare it with people to having this little puppy between you that you're trying to grow. And I know this sounds graphic, but if you stab that puppy too many times, it's going to bleed to death. Or if you neglect that puppy, it's going to die of starvation. And that's what a relationship is like. It's like a living, breathing thing that you're trying to grow with somebody else. And it is that fragile. And I think people don't realize that it is this fragile thing, and that we can't treat it as if it's unbreakable or made of diamonds that are, that can't be harmed. And one of the things that we talked about, you and I know you and I are we're feminists in a sense that we've always been very successful women. And we love that about ourselves. But to be a successful woman doesn't mean we have to emasculate a man.
Right.
And yet we see a lot of women do that to men. And men are actually more fragile than women are.
Absolutely. You never hear anywhere where they talk about men being resilient, because it's not a thing. Men are strong. That is the absolute actual fact, but they are not very resilient. And we're probably going to get some comments about this, but that's okay. They can challenge it. But the reality is men are strong and women are typically the more resilient ones in the relationship. We have the better bounce back.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And just like you watch men in relationships, I've been listening to a lot of country Christmas songs because my husband is a country music fan. And oftentimes they're talking about, the sad Christmas where, somebody's left somebody else or whatever it is. And one song in particular talks about a country music man is singing about his woman that's left him, and he says, and I'll be over you by New Year's Eve. And that kind of is the way that men get over things, is they just get somebody else and move on. Doesn't mean they've actually dealt with their feelings.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't mean that they don't have them,
Mm-hmm.
somewhere along the way, all those stuffed down feelings come out somehow. Mm-hmm. And, you know, one of the things I think about being in love with somebody else is that we understand what triggers them, and then we make a commitment within ourselves to avoid those triggers for that person. Mm-hmm. And I think what I see more often is that people will use those things they know triggers the other person in a moment of anger. Mm-hmm. And that's absolutely against the rules of emotional intimacy. So if you want to be deeply emotionally intimate with someone else, there are rules. And I think I didn't understand this. And I have to say, you know, telling on myself is that I didn't know this for a long time. And I was in my 40s when I finally found the work of Dr. John Gottman. I was kind of forced into a situation where I was teaching couples the couples workshops from Dr. John Gottman, because I'd had a lot of experience in front of groups of people before I became a counselor, because I worked for an airline as a trainer. And then I became a counselor. So I'm back to school later in life to get my master's and became a counselor, and had all those years of experience in front of crowds of people. So one of my very first jobs, they needed somebody to teach these groups of people, couples, this stuff from Dr. John Gottman. So the way that it was formatted is that there was a video of Dr. Gottman and his wife, and they would role play stuff about how to do things and what the rules were of relationships that he'd found in his research. And then I would facilitate an exercise that the couples did together. And I remember sitting there watching these videos of Dr. Gottman and his wife role playing how not to do things and then how to do things, and thinking to myself, no wonder none of my relationships have worked, because I was doing everything on the how not to do things. And there are rules where relationships are concerned. I just didn't know what the rules were.
And if we don't exercise the proper rule, we're going to make up our own rules as we go along anyway. And that will be the way in which we communicate all of the time, instead of it being, for lack of healthy, instead of it being healthy. We'll continue these unhealthy patterns of relating to one another. And then just the years go by, and the year goes by, and someone gets tired, and and people make a commitment just to stay in a relationship, but they're not really happy, and then you have all these unhealthy cycles. So if hopefully having this conversation, we can help people to break out of some of that.
I agree. And so if we were to try and help people, what would be you think the first step people would need to take in order to be more emotionally safe for other people?
I always say, and this is really in any relationship, lead with the love. If we lead with the love, we remember through that process. So we don't want to say or do things to people that we love. So if we remember, we love this person, and because we love them, there are certain things we will and won't say. And some people just have to be taught, because we're taught that once you get angry, or we're shown this, not taught, we're shown this, once you get angry, the gloves come off. You hear people say that all the time. But the reality is, no, that's really when the gloves should stay on, mm-hmm. is when you've gotten to that point where you feel like, I'm this angry. This would help, I think, build the relationship better if you can exercise that restraint, not say things that you can never, ever take back again, and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, in the Dr. Gottman stuff, he talks about timeout. And I think being one of the first skills that I teach people is timeout. And it's not about learning to just walk away, because people feel abandoned when someone walks away. It's learning about how to walk away, calm your body down, and then come back and decide, are we still going to talk? Because people feel abandoned from walking away, and yet walking away is necessary in order to calm the body down. And so Dr. Gottman suggests that people have a hand signal. I used to tell people more than one finger, please.
Definitely. That's good. That is good.
I suggest like the football timeout signal, you know. But if they have a signal that they agree on, even if it's just like a, you know, hand or whatever, then when they get too angry, they don't say anything they don't mean. And then they just walk away. And he suggests 20 minutes because they've recorded the body needing 20 minutes to process all of the hormones that get fired off when you get angry. And then you can't be thinking about what you want to say next. You have to be honestly distracting yourself. Mm-hmm. And take a walk, whatever, and then come back. And then when we come back, to honestly decide, do I want to talk about this some more? Because I loved one of the things from Dr. Gottman's research that, again, this is the second thing I teach people after timeout, is that he found that 69% of your issues will never be resolved. It's basic personality differences that can't be resolved. And I think that if people know that it's not going to be resolved over time, he says small compromises are reached, but it could take a lifetime. Mm-hmm. If it's talked about respectfully, that small compromises do get reached. But people keep thinking they have to resolve something when in actuality, the majority of your issues won't ever be resolved. And I think knowing that, sometimes we relax a little bit and kind of go, oh, okay, this one, we'll probably find a compromise somewhere down the road, but it's really not going to resolve today. So maybe I don't need to. And knowing that seems to relax people a lot. Knowing that down the road, it'll probably compromise somewhere, but doesn't have to be resolved today. What do you think about that idea?
And I think just since we've talked about that a lot, that's what I've been sharing with couples that I've actually been doing treatment with. The other thing is just watching what you say, period. There's certain things in relationships that should never, ever come out of your mouth. And that's part of those rules that I know we'll get into. But name calling, that should always be off limits. Thank you for joining us for It's All in Your Head podcast. Remember to subscribe, like, share, and please comment. Whatever mental health questions you have, we will be happy to answer them in future podcasts. You know, also that button pushing. I think about a movie that I watched where there's the thing is the husband always calls the wife crazy. And because she, in her mind, is a little bit crazy, that upsets her as much as it could. So it's just watching that, like, because he'll say, you're crazy. She's like, don't say it. Mm-hmm. And then he'll say it. And then it's like, that's it. So it's just making sure that we exercise those boundaries and those rules with inside of our relationship, that so that we are maintaining the stability that we have, because sometimes that even the stability is fragile. Mm-hmm. And we have to recognize that.
You know, that's really true. In fact, there's something called gaslighting, which is where we purposely push someone's buttons and light them up and then play the victim when they get angry. Mm-hmm. And people who are gaslighters, they know who they are, you know. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that's exactly what you're describing, where you just push somebody's buttons and not purposely push them to the brink. And then when they go over that brink, you play the victim, like, oh, look what you've done to me, you know. And it's not a good place to be. It's a very unhealthy relationship structure for sure.
Mm-hmm. And it's in realize it's definitely differences in, I want to say, in the gender. I don't even want to call it, you know, man, woman, but it's differences. The way that we communicate is going to be different. And we need to know that. So I say again, men are strong, women are resilient. So I've had to tell some women, even if you all choose not to stay together, this man has the right to leave this relationship with his testicles. You don't get to cut them off and then expect for him to be functional as a man. That just doesn't happen. So, in us being very careful with the way that we handle each other. And again, we wouldn't talk to our friends the way we talk to our spouses. We just wouldn't do it. And we expect for them to understand, or we expect for them to understand that we love them, but we don't look. It's almost like water just running over the top of a rock. Eventually it begins to erode that rock, or the surface of that rock. And we want to be able to protect our relationships against that.
Yeah, I like that. That's a good one. Well, and all of that stuff that you're talking about, as far as like name calling and things like that, is under the heading of contempt, which is anything where you treat somebody as if you are superior to them and they're inferior in some way. It's the single best predictor relationships will end, according to the research. And so you want to make sure. And it oftentimes is accompanied by rolling your eyes at someone. And it just means that I feel superior. The way I see the world in my eyes is superior to the way you see the world. And that kind of superiority is the single best reason, or the single best predictor that relationships will end, is if I feel like my way of seeing the world is superior to yours. I think it's really important to understand that everybody has a different view of the world, that you can have two people in the same home growing up having the same experiences, and we'll still come out of that home with a very different view of what happened. And it's just differences in people and how they're experiencing the world and how they're interpreting it. And so there isn't a right or wrong.
Absolutely. That's exactly what I was going to say. Just because it's different doesn't mean that my way is right and your way is wrong. We just have to acknowledge that the way that we see it is different.
Mm-hmm. And actually, it can be really beautiful in some ways. I think that if we know that about somebody else, that I have a different view and your view isn't wrong, it's just different, then curiosity can kick in, and we can become curious about
Mm-hmm.
another person,
Mm-hmm.
and wanting to know how they see the world, and not in a judgmental way, but more in a just, that's interesting kind of way. That's what, if I were to have like an idealistic view of how I'd like to see the world and see people move forward and relate, it would be that they would become curious about each other rather than angry at each other and judgmental of each other, but instead curious about how you see the world versus how I see the world. And I wonder if something somebody else is doing is working better for them, if maybe there's something they're doing that I could incorporate into my world that works a little bit better for me, rather than all of this judgmentalness that seems to be happening among people right now. I think it's lonely for people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Or you should be able, you said this earlier when we were talking, that people are much more willing to be physically naked in front of someone than emotionally naked.
Mm-hmm.
And to kind of flip that on its head would be great, because being able to have that emotional connection and that emotional nakedness should enhance the physical relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And being able to talk to people about that and explain that to them and get them really to get a buy-in related to that would be great, because that's exactly right. There's so much that's different about your spouse or your partner that should be able to kind of enhance who you are as a person and enhance your overall living experience, period.
Yeah, and that means having the courage to ask the deep questions like, what are you looking forward to? How do you feel about it? Those kind of questions those are the kind of questions that we want to ask each other and find out, you know, what are your goals? What are your aspirations? How do you feel about those? Just asking people things like that and really wanting to know what other people's views of the world are. What are your dreams that you haven't had come true yet? Really wanting to know those kind of things and being safe for somebody to be able to express those kind of things. All of us have a really deep down desire to have at least one or two people in the world that we can talk with on that level. Mm-hmm. Now, you talked about the gender differences, and I was thinking about that. There is a gender difference, and it isn't always male, female, but there is a difference in communication styles. And in general, the more masculine communicators don't really like the fluff. Like they don't want to, they're just much more direct communicators. And then the more feminine communicators really communicate in great detail. And when those two kind of communicators are trying to talk to each other, the conversation can be difficult. And so what I tell people is for those who are the more masculine communicators are sometimes problem solvers. Like they think they want to jump in and solve a problem that the feminine communicator is just talking about. Mm-hmm. So the masculine communicator, being a problem solver, would want to not solve. They would just listen. And if they feel an urge to solve a problem, ask first. Did you want my advice on that, or did you just want me to listen? Because those more masculine communicators oftentimes are more of a jump in and solve a problem, right? But ask first and otherwise just listen. Now, the more feminine communicators oftentimes will, in the process of just hearing themselves talk, will solve their own problems just by hearing themselves talk, which is why they can have one opinion at the beginning of a conversation, and by the time they're finished talking about it, have completely changed their opinion, because they will have listened to themselves talk and go, oh, that doesn't sound quite right. I think it's this instead, which can be confusing to a masculine communicator. But she is honestly working it through, and she just needs a sounding board, right? And so if you're a more feminine communicator, just know that when you're communicating with a masculine communicator, you want to just do just the facts and not give all of the flowery, every single detail, because you'll lose the interest of the masculine communicator. And so sometimes if you just know that as you're communicating, sometimes you can come together a little bit better. So the masculine problem solving personality stops solving problems, and the feminine, flowery communicator just shorten it a little bit, and you have much more success as you're trying to communicate with each other.
The other thing that to take into account when I'm doing couples counseling with people, especially when one or both have an identified mental health issue, that we speak to that. I'm not just angry or flying off the handle or emotionally unstable. This reaction that you're getting is directly related to the anxiety that I feel around the conversation. And to be able to give voice to that so that the other person understands, because it could seem very irrational. Some people's defense mechanism to stop from getting anxious is to lash out. So to start to identify those kind of things and be able to talk each other through that and come up with the words, okay, right now, is it you talking or is it this anxiety that you feel about the conversation? Let's talk about that first. And then see where the conversation goes from there.
Oh, that's a good one too. I'm learning things from you today. Yeah, so if we think more about what would be the next steps of that emotional intimacy that we're trying to help people create, definitely non-judgmental, definitely no judgment with people. Now, non-judgment doesn't mean we always approve of everything someone is saying. Right. And it doesn't always mean that we don't have advice we want to give. But remember what I said about advice, you know. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that as far as relationships go too. When we're in a relationship with a partner or a friend, like a lover or a friend, we really have to make sure we're talking to an equal. And if we're talking to an equal, then we want to ask permission before we give advice. We want to make sure that it's okay with them that we're giving advice, because there are certain relationships where advice is expected, and those relationships are kind of tipped. They're tilted a little bit more into a mentor to a mentee relationship. And everybody walks into that relationship with that understanding. You're a therapist and you're walking into a session, and the therapist is the understood mentor. And if the therapist gives advice in that session, it's expected. Your boss, and you walk into that, and your boss is in charge, and you walk into a work setting where there's a tipped relationship that both people agree to in that setting. And as long as people are in those settings where this type of relationship is agreed upon, the communication is different. But when we get into relationships where that is not the agreed upon dynamic with friends or lovers, you can't just walk into those relationships and tip it like that, tip the balance. That's why you have some of these relationships that are not working, where you have a really a very, maybe a parenting type. One of the partners is too parent-like. They're very advice-giving, very controlling. They're always telling the other person what to do. And they've become a parent-child relationship rather than equals. And I see that sometimes in these relationships as they come in for couples counseling. That's not going to work, because this is not a sexual relationship. And it can't just keep going from this to this. It has to remain an equal relationship. And so we really have to treat it that way and make sure that that partner is not being treated like a child. And hopefully they're not acting like a child, or if they are, that has to be addressed as well, you know. But there definitely needs to be a dynamic where both are being treated as equals, and the communication stays on that level too. And then it can remain emotionally intimate and safe for both people. I don't know, any thoughts on that, Tara?
I think about there, because there's some cases where there's a certain level of training, I'll call it, that might need to take place. So considering parenting, if you have two parents coming in, two new parents, and one has never ever changed a diaper, there's a certain level of training that has to come in. But I think that when certain things happen, we've got to handle those types of situations just like that, and understand that if the diaper is backwards, it's still okay. It's on the baby. Like, you know, so when you have those kind of things that are delicate that we need to be talking about, I might know how to do it and you don't. How do we handle that? And how do you want me to communicate that to you? How would you best receive it from me? Because it needs to be given, but the manner is very important. And there's a lot of times there's disappointment from one or the other based on the end result. I'll say that. So again, it might not be perfect, or one side might be higher than the other side on the diaper, but the diaper is still on and the baby is safe. That's what we have to look at. What is the end result? What are we trying to accomplish? We just want to make sure the baby's in a clean diaper. It doesn't have to be exactly how you want it or how you do it, but we've got to make sure that that gets done. And so looking at it in that way, not a right or wrong. You can't expect perfection. You've got to be able to communicate. And if there's shortfalls, where do we address those shortfalls? It's not based on just what I think is good. It's based on whether or not, like, we come up with it. So I would say in the case of the diaper incident, since that's the example that I'm using, if it's an issue of safety, if it's an issue of health, if it's an issue of sanity, that's when we need to really drill down and address those in very specific terms, but not you didn't do it how I want it done. Mm-hmm. And being very careful of that balance when we're dealing with those kinds of issues. When I say, what do you think about that, Michelle?
I agree with you. Yeah, because it can't be one person just saying, like you said, it's not done the way I want it. Because that's the parent-child dynamic. It has to be done much more delicately. And interestingly, and you're right, it has to be talked about, and it has to be treated as if you are my equal. Let me help you if you'll allow it, and how will you allow it? Mm-hmm. And that's how you would talk to an equal. If I'm talking to a child, I would say it in a much different way than I would say it if I were talking to an equal. Mm-hmm. And it's just about, how do I see this person? And that is really what marriage is. And when I tell people, when I found out about that 69% that can't be resolved, that means there's like only 31% of our issues that can be. So here's kind of my rundown of what a good marriage looks like. And it's really trying to enhance that 31% of compatibility that we have, and respectfully dance around the 69% that doesn't work. And you spend a lifetime doing that, enhancing that 31% and respectfully dancing around, and without demasculinizing or defeminizing, the other person around this majority of issues that can't be resolved. And that's what a good relationship looks like. And that's why it's hard work. Not this impossible thing where you're fighting about the stuff that can never be resolved anyway and tearing each other apart. That's just impossible. And that will never work. Thank you for joining It's All in Your Head podcast. I just want to remind you to subscribe, like, share, and comment below. Thank you. But the hard work, go ahead.
No, I was going to say that just brought something in my mind. So let's talk a little bit about gender roles. How do you feel about that? What are some things that we can tell people regarding that?
Well, that's an interesting one, because when I married Serge, his wife had been really ill for a long time, and she had diabetes complications, and then she had an amputation, and then got a infection and ended up dying from it. And because she'd been sick for such a long time, he'd played both mom and dad for a really long time. So there weren't any gender roles. I had also been a single parent, so I had been both mom and dad for a really long time. And so for us, it just kind of naturally was just like, what do you like doing best? For us, that was our gender role, was whatever each person liked doing best, and the way that things fell in line with us. And we never really have been very married to any gender roles. I think that's been an advantage for us, because things have happened to us financially off and on over the years, where one person has been more the breadwinner and then the other, and it hasn't mattered. And that's been nice. We've had just different things back and forth. And so we don't really have gender roles in our home. And between he and I, it's coming up on 13 years now. So my opinion of it is that it needs to be flexible, personally. What about you?
I think that it should be flexible to a certain extent, but I think just because David is who he is and I am who I am, there's certain things that we've fallen into. So I cook. He tells a joke that he knows how to cook, but if he ever showed me, he wouldn't get the meals that he gets. But I don't think he can cook. Not that well. I think he's learned some things over the years of watching me, but also he's a better cleaner. He is, and part of that goes into like our issue. When I have a PTSD moment it looks like a whirlwind. It's out of control for me. And he's been kind of like the stabilizing factor that pulls that in. I do nothing outside. I don't mow grass. I don't rake leaves. I don't plant flowers. I don't do any of that. And he's much better at that than I am. So, you know, I never have to worry about that at all. So it's like, it's flexible. I don't have to take out the trash ever. Mm-hmm. But I take it out, but I don't have to. I remember one time, and it's funny to me, I just kind of mentioned the trash was getting full, and I was like, oh, babe, I think the trash is getting a little full, or something I said. And he was like, okay, take it out. And I had a visceral reaction. And he kind of chuckled because he knew. I'm like, take the trash out. It just was like, and then he laughed and he was like, you know, I got it. And I was like, okay. But it was just even my reaction because I just never had to. And I mentioned, I know he got it. So it was just like those kinds of things. But for us, we've just naturally fallen into these lines, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And I'm okay with it. And I'm the first one to say, I love letting men be men. He can pick up whatever he wants to for me. He can carry things. I have nothing to prove as far as my strength. Period. So that's kind of how I feel about it. Even though I know I'm strong, it's funny because I helped him pull our riding lawnmower up a hill once it ran out of gas. So I'm like, yeah, I got this. But I don't have to do that kind of stuff. So it's good to know that I can, but I'm glad to know I have somebody who is here for me, who I don't ever have to do that stuff. He lets me be me and do all the things that I need to do. And I think that is something that's important. And you mentioned it's 13 years for you and Serge, and we just celebrated 16 years. Mm-hmm. And both of us have been married before. Mm-hmm. And so it's just funny because it's so much that you learn that really just comes down to who we are as people and making it work and celebrating the differences and loving one another through our struggles and all of those things that early on, if I had known, I probably would have been more successful in those types of endeavors, but those weren't meant to be. This one was. So it was like, this is great. And here we are. And loving it and loving what we learn from each other and loving what we give to one another. That's important too. And also just thinking about that and talking about it and reminding each other of how much we mean to one another. That's important too. That I don't mind looking at him and telling him how good he looks, even after these almost 20 years of being together, you know? So it's just like all of those kind of things that we forget that we have to begin to remember once we get into the monotony of relationship, because they become monotonous after time. You know, you're with someone for over a decade, you know, it can become monotonous. So it's just pulling back and remembering those things. That's very important.
There's a conscious effort involved with that too. And I'm noticing that because like you said, over a decade, and my husband's love language is words of affirmation. And it's not my love language. Mine is more acts of service. And I have to remind myself to give him those words of affirmation. And I know that when I first realized when we were early on in our relationship that his love language was words of affirmation, I would kind of consciously force myself to tell him things that I loved about him all the time, and feeling almost like I was rolling my eyes in the back of my head as I was doing it, you know. Yes, you're wonderful, you know, because I just don't need it. And so it felt foreign to be doing it. It doesn't feel so much that way anymore. But I know that I need to be more conscious of it, even more so now, because like you said, it does become, you know, monotonous if we're not careful of fostering it. And I need to tell him that more, especially lately. I know I need to tell him that more about how much it means to me that, you know, he's been home because Delta's hasn't brought him back to work yet. So he's been home for almost 8 months for the coronavirus. And I haven't had to do anything. I haven't had to cook or clean or anything. I go to work, I see a bunch of clients, I come home. And other than the fact that he's kind of lonely and he talks a lot when I get home, other than that, I really have nothing I have to do, like nothing. And oh, an interesting thing that happened a few months ago is I noticed this when I dropped something and he immediately picked it up. And I started to kind of notice that he was like, I would follow, it was almost like every time I dropped something, he was immediately there to pick it up. And I asked him why he did that. I said, it seems like you're like, every time I drop something, you're like immediately there to pick it up. And he said, he thought about it and he said, oh, you've always had a bad back. So I've always just picked things up for you. And I've always had a really bad back. I have degenerative disc disease, but about 2 years ago, I had stem cell injections all down my back and it completely cured my degenerative disc disease. The stem cell injections are awesome. If you ever want to check into those. And he didn't realize that I can bend over just fine now. He still has this habit of, but I just thought how sweet that he had just developed this habit of recognizing every time I drop something that he should just pick that up for me, you know? And I thought that was really sweet. He had also taken over any housework where I had to bend over, like bending over a bathtub to clean it. He did all that because I couldn't. And I couldn't weed unless I bought this little bench that I could sit and weed my flower beds, because I had to sit with my back straight in order to be able to do it. I can now bend over and weed the flower beds. I mean, a lot has changed from the stem cell injections, but he had adapted to my bad back in that way. And I thought that was just so sweet. And I hadn't even noticed it till a couple of months ago.
And I think that gets to that once you are more solid in your relationships, that unspoken level of communication that just naturally comes. So there's so many things to look forward to in building a positive, healthy relationship. I think that's what I want to say about that, because that unspoken language is so important. Because just like when you're saying, Serge, even the bending over, if I'm stressed, my husband knows everything. He can tell if I didn't sleep well. He can tell by what I'm doing. He'll even say, you must be going through a little something. And I'm like, why do you say that? You know, because I might not even recognize it as readily as he does, but he's very much in tune to me and what I'm doing and what I'm saying and how it's looking. And all of that has come with the fact that we've taken time and spent time in the relationship building that. It's very important that we do that. Or if it's something that and I can tell, and I'm usually the one who can kind of like be the minimalist in the situation. I can bring myself down real low if he's having a moment, just to kind of tune in and listen and hear what it is that is happening. So it's like, just those are things to look forward to. And I know I've always said to people, and this was earlier, if most of us or more of us were more honest about marriage, less people will be rushing into it. And it's just, you know, but there's so on the flip side of that, all of the positives that come in being in a good, sound, healthy marriage or long-term relationship.
Right. And the positives being that you do have somebody that is a constant companion for you. You've always got somebody to do something with and plans and things to look forward to. You've got a constant sexual companion and it gets better all the time. You've got somebody who knows you, like you said, knows you inside and out, knows your moods, that kind of thing. Those are some of the things that are not everyday things, but they're things that over time really mean something, having that there for you. And you don't need it every day, but you need it periodically, and having it there and making the work so that you always have that there is what makes a good relationship worth putting the work in for.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Shakespeare compared love to a rose. Gottman uses a different metaphor, an emotional bank account. You know how a regular bank account works, so what's an emotional bank account? It represents the positive and negative balance in your relationship. The best couples maintain a high balance. Couples that break up are often in the red. You make deposits through positive interactions, and you withdraw through negative ones. What does a deposit look like? It's a simple act of showing your partner that you care for and support them. It's as easy as sending your partner a good luck text before a meeting or cooking them dinner after a long day. And pay attention when your partner shows you their admiration and support. Notice when they're investing in your relationship.
Thank you.
A withdrawal is either hurtful behavior toward your partner or ignoring their invitations to connect. But withdrawals and deposits don't have equal weight. In fact, Gottman found it takes 5 positive interactions to make up for 1 negative one. Happy couples maintain at least this 5-to-1 ratio. If you make constant deposits and keep your balance high, you're saving up for a rainy day when you'll need to cash in on that goodwill. Gottman notes that small daily deposits, like asking your partner how their day was, is far more important than the occasional over-the-top romantic gesture. Positivity leads to more positivity. This is not about keeping score. It's about investing in your relationship and your shared emotional bank account, moving from me to we. So keep your balance high by doing nice things every day and recognizing when your partner does them for you. You'll build up that emotional bank account in no time.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for It's All in Your Head podcast. This has been episode 14. And remember,
mental health matters.
And if you don't deal with your stuff, it's going to deal with you. Bye-bye.
Bye.